South Armagh, the mid-1970s. A Saracen armoured vehicle is working its way along the narrow lanes near Crossmaglen. Engine noise bouncing back off hedgerow walls. The crew sealed inside behind armour plate, watching the same roads they've watched every day of this rotation. The lane is barely wide enough for the vehicle. On both sides, the hedgerows press close enough that a man crouching in them would be invisible until he was already past. The driver knows this. He knows every bend and every farm gate on this particular stretch. What he can't know is what is already in position beneath the road surface ahead. A command wire device packed into a culvert, the wire running back several hundred metres to a firing point in cover. After the smoke clears, as it did again and again across these same roads throughout the second half of the decade, the British Army does something that defines the next 2 decades of the conflict in South Armagh. It gives the roads to the IRA. Toby Harnden, whose book Bandit Country became required reading for British units rotating into the province, documents how the shift unfolded. Over the course of the mid to late 1970s and into the 1980s, as culvert bomb after culvert bomb tore through vehicle convoys on the border lanes, the British Army gradually conceded ground-level movement across South Armagh. Every soldier, every supply run, every commanding officer moving through the area would come to do so by helicopter. Not because there was nothing left to fight with on the ground, because the ground itself had been conceded. To understand how completely the Provisional IRA had achieved this, you need numbers. Between 1970 and 1997, the South Armagh Brigade was responsible for the deaths of 123 British soldiers and 42 RUC officers, 165 security force personnel in total. In terms of lethality per square mile, it was the most dangerous operational environment for British forces anywhere in Western Europe. Understanding why requires understanding the ground itself. South Armagh is border country, a patchwork of small farms, hedgerows, narrow lanes, bogland, and hills pressed directly against the Irish Republic. The geography was close to ideal for an insurgency. The border offered IRA active service units an escape route that British forces couldn't legally cross. The hedgerows gave concealment to both shooters and observers. The narrow lanes funneled armoured vehicles into predictable routes at predictable speeds. Isolated farmhouses offered IRA observers unimpeded sightlines down every approach road for miles. The hills above Crossmaglen and Fork Hill provided elevated observation points where a single man with binoculars could track a British patrol long before it reached its destination. This wasn't simply favourable terrain exploited opportunistically. The South Armagh Brigade built its operational methods around it with genuine, sustained sophistication. An organisation that had spent years studying the ground, mapping the choke points, identifying every drainage culvert that ran beneath a road, and calculating how much explosive it would take to destroy what passed over it. Command wire IEDs were the primary tool. Buried in culverts, drainage pipes running beneath road surfaces, then triggered remotely once the target vehicle was directly overhead. The technique avoided the radio signal vulnerabilities of remote detonation and gave the firing team precise control. A command wire could run 300 metres or more to the triggerman's position, giving him time to observe through binoculars, confirm his target, and initiate the device at the exact right moment. No ambiguity, no premature detonation. The bomb goes off when the axle is directly above it, not before. On the 27th of August 1979, this methodology reached its most catastrophic expression. At Warrenpoint, near Narrowwater Castle on the shores of Carlingford Loch, the South Armagh Brigade had spent weeks preparing a layered ambush of a precision that the British Army's own assessments later described with a kind of professional respect. A device weighing approximately 360 kilograms, hidden in hay bales on a trailer parked at a predictable point along the Newry to Warrenpoint road, was detonated beneath a convoy from the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment. 6 soldiers died in the initial blast. The force of it was enormous. The Para's vehicles were physically thrown from the road, and the explosion was heard miles away across the loch in the Republic. Survivors scrambled to what looked like cover, the gatehouse of Narrow Water Castle, a substantial stone structure set back from the road. This was precisely what the South Armagh Brigade had planned for. A second device, larger than the first, had been pre-positioned there, command wire already run to a firing point across the border on the southern bank of the loch. When the British gathered at the gatehouse and the follow-on forces arrived, the IRA detonated the second bomb. 12 more soldiers died in that blast, including Lieutenant Colonel David Blair of the Queen's Own Highlanders, who had arrived by helicopter to command the initial response. 18 British soldiers killed in total, the largest single loss of life the Army suffered throughout the entire Troubles, executed through patient planning, detailed ground reconnaissance, and a precise understanding of how British forces would respond to a contact. The South Armagh Brigade knew because they had watched. They always watched. The IRA's mortar capability added another dimension to the pressure on static bases. The Mark 15, known informally as the Barrack Buster, was a homemade weapon, but not a crude one. Manufactured in improvised workshops, mounted on lorry platforms that could be driven to a firing position and abandoned, the system could loft a projectile carrying roughly 500 pounds of explosive over the perimeter walls of fortified positions. Crossmaglen's joint Army and RUC base drew repeated mortar attacks throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. Veterans described it as a besieged outpost, surrounded by an unsympathetic civilian population in a Republican stronghold, resupplied only by air, regularly targeted from the surrounding buildings and fields. In March 1993, the IRA used a lorry-mounted battery of Mark 15 mortars against the base at Keady. A 25-year-old civilian contractor named Nigel McCollum was killed in the barrage. He had been working on the base. He had nothing to do with the conflict. He was simply in the way of a weapon that didn't distinguish. By 1976, a BBC Panorama documentary had broadcast the phrase that defined the area: bandit country. A senior British Army officer had coined it privately. The label stuck because it was accurate. 60 miles to the northwest, the East Tyrone Brigade had absorbed the same strategic logic. Jim Liner, the brigade's chief theorist in the early 1980s, had developed an approach drawn from Maoist revolutionary doctrine. Establish a liberated zone, expand it, make the security forces' presence untenable area by area. The South Armagh area was already there, Liner believed. British troops and the RUC couldn't use its roads for fear of roadside bombs and long-range harassing fire. That was the template he intended to replicate in East Tyrone. It wasn't an unreasonable assessment. On the 20th of August 1988, the East Tyrone Brigade detonated 200 pounds of Semtex beneath a bus carrying 36 soldiers of the light infantry along the Ballygawley to Omagh Road. 8 soldiers died. The blast threw the bus 30 metres down the road and scattered wreckage and wounded men across the surrounding fields. After Ballygawley, the British Army began ferrying its troops to and from East Tyrone by helicopter, not as a response to the specific attack, but as a recognition that the ground had become untenable, in the same way South Armagh's roads had become untenable more than a decade earlier. At each point where the IRA's ground-level effectiveness peaked, the British concentrated more of their capability into the aerial dimension. Not because they had chosen to, because they had no other option. The base that made all of this possible was Bessbrook Mill, a former linen mill on the edge of the village of Bessbrook, roughly 4 miles north of Newry. It had been converted into the operational hub of British activity in South Armagh. Every resupply run, every personnel movement, every immediate reaction force launch, every SAS insertion and extraction in South Armagh passed through Bessbrook. One documentary account described it as the busiest SAS helipad in Europe during the height of the conflict. More helicopter movements through a single site than any comparable installation on the continent. SAS units, 14 intelligence company surveillance teams, line infantry battalions, RUC officers, supply contractors, and visiting senior officers. All of them arrived and departed by air. The sound of rotors was as constant at Bessbrook as the sound of wind. The helicopter had become the circulatory system of British operations in bandit country. The IRA had noticed, and they began hunting the helicopters. On the morning of 17th February 1978, Lieutenant Colonel Ian Corden Lloyd flew from Bessbrook Mill in an Aerospatiale Gazelle, serial number XX404. He was the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion Royal Green Jackets, and by the accounts of those who served under him, a soldier the Army regarded as genuinely gifted. The Royal Green Jackets had been in South Armagh since December 1977, 2 months into their rotation, already taking casualties, already operating in the compressed, cautious rhythm that South Armagh imposed on every unit. What called Corden Lloyd up that morning was an ongoing gun battle near Jonesborough, a small village hard on the border, about 8 kilometres northeast of Crossmaglen. A Royal Green Jackets observation post had come under heavy fire from IRA positions along the Edenapper Road, where the ground runs parallel with the Irish border through the Dromad Woods. The IRA unit was firing from the east side of the road, from positions in the tree line, with the border barely a few hundred metres behind them. Corden Lloyd flew out with a captain and a sergeant to see the contact, assess what was happening, and coordinate the response. They were escorted by a scout helicopter carrying an airborne reaction force, a medic and 3 soldiers, the standard arrangement for this type of mission. The Gazelle was the faster, lighter aircraft. The Scout carried the follow-on infantry. The Gazelle came over the contact area and went into a hover to observe. This is the moment the IRA had prepared for. The active service unit waiting in the Dromad Woods opened fire. A barrage of tracer rounds came up through the morning air at the hovering aircraft. Later accounts from the scout crew described watching the stream of fire reach the Gazelle's airframe. The pilot initiated a hard, high-speed turn to break away from the gunfire. At that speed, in that turn, he lost control. The Gazelle hit a low wall at the field's edge and went into the ground, striking twice, the rotor blades hammering into the soil as the airframe cartwheeled across the field. It came to rest approximately 100 metres from the initial impact point, lying on its right side. The scout crew landed the airborne reaction force under continued IRA fire. The soldiers ran to the wreck. Corden Lloyd was dead. The captain and the sergeant were badly wounded. The pilot survived, trapped in the wreckage, but protected by his helmet. He was eventually pulled free. The IRA unit crossed the border into the Republic and disappeared into the Dromad Woods. Some Garda officers watching from the other side had witnessed the attack. The British Army initially told the press the incident had been a flying accident. The Ministry of Defence's own later declassified files confirmed what actually happened. Corden Lloyd was awarded a posthumous mention in dispatches. He was 36 years old. His death was the single most senior British officer killed in a helicopter engagement during the entire Troubles, and it illustrated with brutal precision the central tactical problem: The IRA had forced the army into the air and then waited to kill them when they came down low enough. For the IRA, the Jonesborough shootdown validated a strategic approach. For the British, it clarified what was required. Not just helicopters flying higher, something that turned the aircraft from a target into a threat in its own right. Something that made being in the open, away from ground forces, the most dangerous place an IRA team could be. To understand what that required, you have to treat helicopter sniping as what it actually is: an applied physics problem with multiple simultaneous variables, each one degrading accuracy, all of them compounding together. Place a trained sniper in a stable firing position, prone behind a wall or braced against a stone building in a South Armagh village, and the physics of the engagement, while demanding, are manageable. The range is fixed. Wind at ground level can be measured and estimated from the movement of grass and leaves. His body is in contact with something solid, something that absorbs and dampens motion. The rifle, the shooter, and the earth beneath him form a relatively stable three-point relationship. Standard marksmanship factors, breathing control, trigger press, sight alignment, operate in something approaching a controlled environment. He has time. He has stability. He waits for the shot. Now place him in the open door of a Westland Lynx, moving at 60 to 100 knots above South Armagh. The door is open. Wind is hitting him at transit speed. The airframe beneath him is vibrating. The engine noise is physical, a pressure against the chest and ears that experienced helicopter crews describe as becoming background noise after years of exposure, but which newcomers find cognitively demanding just to manage. He is secured by a harness against falling out. He is trying to keep a rifle stable and a scope picture clean. Below him, the hedgerows and fields are moving past. The aerodynamic environment surrounding a helicopter in forward flight causes significant vibration throughout the entire airframe. This is the conclusion of detailed computational research on rotor blade dynamics. The main rotor blade is subjected to complex, coupled forces simultaneously: flapping, lead lag, and torsional motion, all of them periodic, all of them propagating through the structure into the cabin where the sniper is trying to work. Rotor blades don't simply spin, they move in 3 dimensions relative to the hub with every rotation, and each cycle sends a pulse of vibration through the fuselage. The scope picture shifts. The barrel moves. The cheek weld against the rifle's stock changes by fractions of a millimeter. At the moment of firing, the barrel isn't pointing at a fixed point in space. It's pointing at a slightly different point for each fraction of a second, in a pattern that repeats with the rotor cycle. That is the first problem. The second arrives simultaneously. The main rotor's downwash, the column of accelerated air driven downward by the blades, creates a turbulent environment around the aircraft door. Any projectile fired through that zone encounters disturbed airflow immediately after leaving the barrel. The downwash can deflect the bullet's path, particularly at shorter distances from the muzzle, where the turbulence is densest, before it dissipates. The magnitude varies with altitude and airspeed, but at the ranges relevant to South Armagh operations, it isn't a factor that can be ignored. Then there is the platform motion vector. When an aircraft is travelling forward at 60 knots, it imparts 60 knots of forward velocity to the sniper's body, the rifle, and the bullet at the moment of firing, in addition to the rifle's own muzzle velocity. Helicopter gunnery doctrine has a name for this: angular rate error. The deviation caused by the aircraft's own motion as the projectile leaves the barrel. The bullet isn't fired from a stationary point in space. By the time it reaches the target, the aircraft has moved further along its flight path. The angular offset between where the barrel was pointing when the trigger was pressed and where the target now sits relative to the aircraft has grown by an amount that depends on the aircraft's speed, the range to the target, and the bullet's time of flight. For a ground sniper engaging a moving target, the standard correction is called lead. Aim ahead of where the target is now at where it will be when the bullet arrives. For a helicopter sniper engaging a stationary ground target from a moving aircraft, the geometry reverses in a way that isn't intuitive until it has been explained carefully. The target isn't moving, the platform is. So the correction reverses. The shooter aims slightly behind the target's apparent position, a technique known as the lagging lead, to account for the aircraft's own travel during the bullet's time of flight. The aircraft moves forward. If you aim directly at the target, the bullet arrives at a point ahead of where the target was when you fired. So you aim behind, and the platform's forward motion carries the bullet's exit point forward to compensate. This is counterintuitive in a specific and operationally dangerous way. Every trained reflex a ground sniper carries, lead the movement, is backwards for this application until he has drilled the opposite reflex until it's automatic. A soldier with 1,000 rounds of ground-based sniper practice carries 1,000 repetitions of a correction that will cause him to miss in the opposite direction from a helicopter door. The wind picture adds complexity that a ground engagement simply doesn't possess. A ground sniper reads wind at one altitude, approximately his own level, adjusted for downrange conditions based on observation. A helicopter sniper must account for 4 distinct wind environments operating simultaneously. The ambient wind at operational altitude, the rotor-induced turbulence immediately around the door, the wind gradient between altitude and ground level, which are frequently significantly different from each other, and the apparent headwind generated by the aircraft's own forward motion through still air. American Marine Corps aerial sniper doctrine specifically identifies wind speed and direction in and around the moving aircraft as primary challenge factors. Not because wind is unique to aerial shooting, but because no single wind reading covers the full problem. You can read the conditions at ground level perfectly and still be working with the wrong picture for the bullet's actual flight path. Firing downward at an angle introduces one further adjustment. When shooting from altitude at a steep downward angle, the rifleman's rule applies. The effective horizontal range to the target is shorter than the actual slant range measured through the air. Bullet drop calculations set for a flat 300-meter engagement will give different impacts when the geometry involves a significant downward angle. In isolation, this is a small correction. Combined with everything else, small errors accumulate into a miss. Each of these variables, rotor vibration, downwash turbulence, platform motion, angular rate error, multiple wind layers, and angle of fire correction, is individually manageable given training. Combined, applied simultaneously, under the noise and vibration and physiological stress of a live operation above hostile ground, they represent a problem set that demands preparation far beyond standard sniper qualification. A man who can shoot expertly from the ground isn't automatically capable of doing anything useful from a helicopter door. The skill set is related but distinct, and the gap between them is exactly as wide as the gap between flying an aircraft on a simulator and flying one in a crosswind with systems failures. The critical point, and the one that matters most for understanding what the British achieved, helicopter sniping isn't a physical impossibility. American Marine Scout sniper instructors have been direct on the record. Helicopter-borne snipers can place precision fire on target, regardless of whether the aircraft is hovering or in forward flight. The physics are calculable. The variables are trainable. Military doctrine in multiple countries treats this as a solved, repeatable skill. What is documented in specialist publications is the existence of dedicated rigging systems paired with pre-calculated firing tables and downrange crosswind compensation factors specific to the helicopter platform. Confirming this capability was engineered as doctrine, not improvised. The firing tables were worked out before the mission. The physics were solved before the aircraft lifted. The system existed and had been validated. The IRA was watching the ground. The primary airframes were the Aerospatiale Westland Gazelle AH-1 and the Westland Lynx, both operated by the Army Air Corps from Bessbrook Mill and RAF Aldergrove under the Consolidated Northern Ireland Regiment AAC. The Gazelle entered British military service in July 1974. The Army Air Corps variant, the SA-341B, designated AH-1, is a light, single-engine helicopter built for observation, reconnaissance and liaison work. It seats 5, weighs 1,800 kilograms fully loaded, carries a rotor of 10.5 meters diameter, and reaches a maximum speed of approximately 310 kilometers per hour. It uses a finestron tail, a shrouded, multi-blade anti-torque device, rather than a conventional tail rotor, which makes it quieter at certain angles and flight profiles than comparable aircraft, harder to hear approaching from directly below or behind. In South Armagh, that characteristic mattered. The Gazelle is agile enough to work at very low level through the contour of the hills and hedgerow lines, hugging the ground to avoid appearing on the horizon until it's already overhead. British Army aviation records describe the Gazelle as having been used in a direct fire role against small targets in South Armagh. The aircraft that carried Cordon Lloyd to his death in 1978 was a Gazelle. The aircraft the IRA prioritised for destruction throughout the 1980s and early 1990s were predominantly Gazelles and Lynxes operating from Bessbrook. The Gazelle's small size and speed made it difficult to track and difficult to engage at range, which also made it an effective observation platform for operations that required moving across ground without announcing the approach far in advance. The Lynx entered AAC service in Northern Ireland from the early 1980s. A twin-engine platform of considerably greater power than the Gazelle, it was fast enough that a specially modified version set the absolute world airspeed record for helicopters in 1986 at 400.87 kilometers per hour. Its operational speed in Northern Ireland was far lower than that, but it carried meaningful payload, flew in worse weather than the lighter Gazelle, and had the endurance for extended patrols. The Lynx-Gazelle pairing was the standard AAC tactical grouping by the mid-1980s, a combination originally developed for the British Army of the Rhine as an anti-armour team against Soviet tanks, repurposed entirely in the South Armagh context. The Gazelle observed and cued. The Lynx carried the response. For the weapons question, timing matters. Through the 1970s and into the early to mid-1980s, the standard British Army precision rifle was the L42A1, a 7.62 by 51mm NATO weapon derived from the Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark 1T sniper, confirmed in operational use throughout Northern Ireland during this period. Any precision aerial engagement in the late 1970s or early 1980s was conducted with this weapon. The Accuracy International PM entered British Army service as the L96A1 in 1984 to 1985. A purpose-designed, purpose-built precision rifle in the same 7.62 by 51 mm caliber, fitted with a Schmidt & Bender 6 by 42 telescopic sight, with a confirmed effective range against man-sized targets of up to 1,000 meters from a stable ground platform. By the early 1990s, when the South Armagh conflict entered its most intense final phase, the L96A1 was the British sniper's standard issue. Sources covering aerial operations in South Armagh confirm explicitly that 7.62 mm fire was delivered from British helicopters operating in the area, the caliber consistent across both weapons, depending on period. The available open record doesn't describe formal, bespoke modifications to individual gazelles or lynxes for a dedicated sniper role. What the evidence points toward is standard aircraft operated with snipers secured in aviation safety harnesses, using their own body muscle tension as the interface between the airframe and the weapon. An elegant solution that kept the rifle isolated from the worst of the vibration by making the shooter himself the dampening layer. What mattered operationally wasn't some classified hardware configuration. It was the techniques, the pre-calculated firing solutions, and the trained coordination between pilot and shooter that made a standard aircraft produce precision outcomes in an operationally demanding environment. The SAS had been present in South Armagh since 1976, deploying from Bessbrook by helicopter to the border areas for surveillance and direct action tasks. The relationship between SAS operators and Army Air Corps crews wasn't peripheral to the mission, it was structural. The aircraft got them into position, extracted them under pressure, provided overwatch during ground operations, and in certain engagements contributed direct fire capability. For a helicopter sniper engagement to function, the two men at its center, pilot and shooter, have to operate as a single precision instrument distributed across two roles. Imagine what the pilot is managing. He is flying a light helicopter at low altitude above hostile ground in a conflict zone where the enemy has heavy machine guns and has brought down aircraft before. He is monitoring his instruments, maintaining altitude awareness, managing fuel, listening to radio traffic from Bessbrook and from his passenger simultaneously. And on top of all of that, he is flying the aircraft to a specific attitude: bank angle, airspeed, altitude, relative bearing to the target, and holding it there with continuous, subtle control inputs. Not a hover, which introduces its own low-frequency oscillation. A controlled transit, slow enough for the sniper to work the problem, fast enough to be a difficult target for anyone below watching the sky. One overcorrection on the cyclic, one moment of inattention, and the sniper's sight picture goes from usable to impossible. The shooter, rigged in the door, is dealing with his own simultaneous problem set. He can't plant the rifle against the airframe. That would transmit every vibration directly into the barrel. Instead, he uses his core muscles, bracing against the doorframe and the harness, creating tension in his own body that acts as mechanical isolation between the aircraft's motion and the weapon. He preloads the trigger through its travel to the point of release and holds it there, waiting for the exact fraction of a second when the sight picture, accounting for the lagging lead, accounting for rotor vibrations' cycling pulse, accounting for the wind gradient, lines up correctly. Then he releases the shot. Not a deliberate squeeze, a disciplined, practiced release at the right moment, a skill that has been built through repetition until the timing is no longer consciously calculated. American aerial sniper doctrine notes that aircraft stability actually increases in controlled forward motion relative to a stationary hover. A slow transit profile, 30 to 40 knots perhaps, gives the shooter a more predictable platform to work from than a helicopter sitting still. The conclusion runs counter to instinct until it has been experienced. Moving is more stable than hovering. The helicopter is, in this limited sense, easier to shoot from when it's flying than when it's stopped. British Army training for Northern Ireland deployments was structured and intensive, with preparation specific to the operational environment of the province built into the pre-deployment cycle. The specifics of the aerial precision shooting element aren't detailed in open sources, appropriately given what was at stake. What is documented is that pre-calculated firing solutions existed for helicopter platforms. Tables incorporating the specific ballistic variables of aerial fire, worked out in advance, carried on the mission. This was engineered capability, not improvised problem-solving. The solutions were solved on the ground before the aircraft lifted. By the late 1980s, the geometry of the conflict had shifted in ways the IRA struggled to account for. The terrain below still looked exactly the same hedgerows, the same bog lanes threading between fields, the same isolated farmhouses with their long, unobstructed views down empty roads in every direction. Nothing visible from ground level indicated that anything fundamental had changed. An IRA active service unit moving across open farmland between operations or taking up a firing position at a field boundary could feel entirely secure in a way they had felt secure for 15 years. No British ground patrol had used that road in years. The nearest hilltop watchtower was 2 kilometres away with limited line of sight. The border was 20 minutes by car. The team had prepared this position carefully, had reconnoitred the approach routes, knew exactly how long they had before anyone at ground level could respond. What they couldn't see was the gazelle, or the lynx, working a patrol arc 2,000 feet above them, covering 15 square kilometres in a single orbit, the observer in the open door scanning through optics at everything below. And they had no framework, no operational experience, no received doctrine, no precedent in their own practice, for calculating whether the man in that door, holding a rifle in a harness against the airframe's vibration, could account for the platform's motion and make a man-sized shot at 300 metres below. Jim Liner's liberated zone theory rested on one central assumption, that military control requires controlling the ground plane. The roads, the hedgerows, the open fields, the border crossing points. Own all of these, and the enemy's presence becomes unviable. He was largely right about this in South Armagh. The IRA had proved he was right. They had owned the ground plane for 15 years. What Liner's theory never incorporated was the third dimension. His doctrine had no entry for what happens when the adversary finds an axis of approach you haven't contested and can't reach. The most extensively documented aerial engagement in South Armagh during this period is the Battle of Newry Road on the 23rd of September 1993. An IRA mobile unit positioned east of Crossmaglen attempted to ambush 3 British helicopters, 1 RAF Puma and 2 Army Air Corps Lynxes as they lifted off from Crossmaglen barracks. This was a carefully prepared operation. The IRA had positioned their team to engage the aircraft at the most predictable point in the departure profile. The moment immediately after liftoff, when altitude is lowest, airspeed is lowest, and the aircraft is most committed to its departure vector. This is sound tactical thinking. The same logic applied to attacking aircraft at any airfield, engaging them at the moment of maximum vulnerability before they can accelerate and climb to safety. Several hundred rounds were expended against the 3 helicopters. All 3 were damaged. All 3 remained airborne. All 3 returned fire. This single engagement captures the core problem the IRA could never solve. Their tactical model assumed the helicopter was a transport asset, Valuable to the British, worth attacking, but essentially passive. Something that flew people and supplies between points and could be killed if you got the angles right. The Battle of Newry Road demonstrated that the aircraft weren't simply flying around. They were armed, they were watching, they were shooting back. The IRA's ambush team, operating with complete confidence in their ground-level tactical logic, position, ambush, withdraw, was engaged back from above before they could complete the maneuver they had trained for. The South Armagh Brigade's broader record against British aircraft shows both the scale of the threat they mounted and its ultimate limits. 23 attacks on British Army helicopters during the Troubles. 5 aircraft brought down across separate occasions. The Gazelle near Jonesborough in February 1978. A Lynx, serial number XZ664, shot down on the 23rd of June 1988, departing Crossmaglen. A second Lynx in February 1991, and a further Lynx and an RAF Puma, both brought down in 1994. By the time of the 1994 successes, Toby Harnden considered the Lynx shooting that year the most tactically significant IRA operation against a helicopter in the entire conflict. The Lynx destroyed in February 1991, serial number ZE380, was brought down near Crossmaglen Square by sustained heavy machine gun fire. The weapon doing this work was almost certainly a Soviet-pattern DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun. Libyan arms shipments to the IRA in the late 1980s had included this weapon, and it began appearing in South Armagh operations from approximately that period. A Dublin television crew happened to be present outside Crossmaglen Health Centre in March 1991 and filmed a sustained machine gun attack against a helicopter, footage that aired nationally and caused considerable political discomfort, not least because the RUC and Army base was 50 yards away, and no immediate response came from inside it. The DSHK is a genuine anti-aircraft system, designed specifically to engage aircraft at close range and effective against lightly armoured vehicles. Its heavy-caliber rounds will bring down a helicopter if they find a critical system. Its arrival in South Armagh forced tactical adjustments on every British helicopter crew in the area. Flight profiles changed, approach angles changed, altitude margins changed. The IRA was treated with the respect that weapon deserved. But the DSHK's effective anti-aircraft envelope has a ceiling. A weapon system firing in reaction to an aircraft it can already see and hear has a limited window. It can't negate a presence operating at altitude before detection. The IRA could kill what they could see at close range when they had prepared for it. They had no answer for what was working the sky above the effective engagement envelope. The IRA also pursued surface-to-air missiles. Soviet SA-7 type weapons reportedly appeared in IRA possession through this period, acquired through the same Libyan network that had supplied the Dishkar. Converting that acquisition into reliable aerial kills proved beyond operational reach throughout the conflict. The helicopters kept flying. The pattern, 23 attacks, 5 confirmed kills, tells a specific story about the nature of the problem. The IRA had correctly identified the helicopter as the primary vector of British capability in South Armagh, assessed it as a priority target, acquired anti-aircraft weapons appropriate to engaging it, studied flight patterns, and positioned to attack. This was methodical, professional operational planning applied to a clearly identified tactical problem. It achieved meaningful results. It failed to solve the underlying strategic problem because the problem wasn't simply that the British had helicopters. It was that the helicopters were doing something the IRA had no doctrine to understand, let alone counter. The psychological record of the IRA's experience with British aerial operations is fragmentary in the open sources. These aren't the kinds of admissions organisations put in press releases. But what exists is consistent in direction. Toby Harnden, who spent years in South Armagh researching his account of the conflict, documents the aerial capability generating genuine, sustained fear among IRA volunteers in the area. The air war history of Northern Ireland records that the IRA came to fear and loathe the helicopter as a category, that a volunteer from the East Tyrone Brigade, writing in his own memoirs, described dreaming of finding a means to defeat them. This isn't the reaction of men who consider themselves to have solved the problem. This is the reaction of an organisation that spent years acquiring Dishkar machine guns and pursuing man-pads and attacking aircraft at departure, and still couldn't make the sky feel safe. The helicopter was in their dreams because it was still overhead when they woke up. The IRA's own sniper campaign, which began in March 1990, creates an unintended mirror of what the British had been doing from altitude for 15 years. The South Armagh Brigade deployed 2 teams equipped with Barrett M82 rifles chambered in 50 BMG, weapons the British Army designated the L82A1 after capturing examples. The Barrett fires a round large enough to defeat body armour at ranges that make identifying the firing position extremely difficult from ground level. At distances of up to 1 kilometre, the IRA's sniper teams killed 7 soldiers and 2 RUC officers over a 7-year campaign, operating from concealed positions in vehicles parked on roadsides or at field boundaries. The effect on British behaviour in South Armagh was immediate and lasting. Soldiers moved differently in areas under sniper threat. They occupied cover differently, ran different patterns when crossing open ground, timed their movements differently. The "Sniper at Work" road signs the IRA posted throughout South Armagh became one of the defining images of the conflict's later phase, not because the signs conveyed operational information, but because they did something more psychologically potent. They confirmed that the threat was deliberate, specific, and watching. British soldiers couldn't see the sniper. They knew he was there. They adjusted everything they did accordingly. This was precisely the operational logic the British had been applying from altitude for 15 years prior. One trained operator in an advantageous position, an advantage the enemy can't locate, can't identify, can't effectively counter, can deny terrain entirely. Not by occupying it, by making the cost of being in the open too high to sustain. The IRA understood this completely when they applied it at ground level. They had never developed a corresponding doctrine for how it applied from above. They had never needed to. Micheál Carraha, identified in multiple accounts as the chief sniper of one of the South Armagh teams, operated in and around Crossmaglen through the early to mid-1990s. In April 1997, an SAS team tracked his unit to a farm complex outside the area and moved in. 4 IRA members were arrested. The Barrett rifles and ammunition were found concealed in a horsebox on the property, the kind of operational security measure a unit under persistent pressure develops over time, keeping the hardware separated from the team until it's needed. The capture was described across multiple sources as the most significant single security force success in South Armagh in more than a decade, possibly the most important of the entire Troubles. By that point, the ground-level precision capability the IRA had invested years in building had been taken off the board. The aerial dimension had never been taken off the board. It had been present, continuous, and effective since the mid-1970s. By 1994, the only way the British Army could safely move across South Armagh was aboard heavy-lift Chinook helicopters, aircraft too large and too fast to be consistently engaged by the weapons the IRA had available on the ground. The RUC formally acknowledged in 1991 that no mobile police patrols had operated in South Armagh without army support since 1975. 16 years of consistent documentation. The ground belonged to the IRA. The air remained contested in a way the IRA never adequately resolved. What the British developed in South Armagh over 20 years wasn't a formal doctrinal revolution written up in a field manual. It was an operational adaptation built under pressure by units that understood they were operating in a conflict without a useful historical parallel. An adversary with genuine tactical sophistication, intimate local knowledge, and a proven ability to read and exploit British operational patterns. The RUC assessment of British combat aviation notes that the helicopter's capacity to penetrate terrain an adversary believes it controls and deliver precise effects, then recover the platform and repeat, had been established from the earliest military use of rotary wing aircraft. South Armagh was the most demanding test that capacity had ever faced in the British operational experience. The operational concept the British made work was simple in theory and extraordinarily difficult in execution. Jim Liner's liberated zone required owning the ground plane. Aerial precision engagement didn't contest the ground plane, it bypassed it entirely, operating in a dimension his theory had no language for. You can own every road junction in South Armagh and still be under observation from 2,000 feet. You can occupy every field boundary and still be the figure a trained sniper is accounting for, resolving the lagging lead, compensating for rotor vibrations' cyclic pulse, reading the layered wind environments, as he holds a trigger in the door of a lynx you can't hear until it's already overhead. The geography that defined the conflict was the same geography the IRA had spent years mastering. The hedgerows that concealed them from ground patrols, the bog lanes that carried them between firing positions and safe houses. The open fields selected precisely because no British foot patrol would approach them across exposed ground. Every escape route perfected, every observation point chosen for its command of the roads below. All of it visible from above. The South Armagh Brigade was, by any objective measure, one of the most formidable paramilitary organisations the British Army faced in the 20th century. It killed 165 security force personnel over 27 years. It forced the complete cessation of British road movement across a significant portion of the United Kingdom's own territory. It conducted a ground-level sniper campaign from 1990 to 1997 that genuinely altered the behaviour and psychology of soldiers who had been serving in the conflict for years. It attacked British helicopters 23 times and brought 5 aircraft down. By the standards of any rural paramilitary unit operating under continuous intelligence pressure, with a fraction of the resources and manpower of the force it was fighting, these are remarkable operational achievements. But the brigade spent those same 27 years mounting those 23 attacks on British helicopters, acquiring Soviet-pattern Dishka machine guns, pursuing surface-to-air missiles through the Libyan supply network, and never finding an adequate answer to the aerial capability operating above its stronghold. The most effective insurgent unit in Western Europe, by casualty rate against British forces, the most lethal paramilitary organisation the army faced anywhere, couldn't solve the problem of a trained operator in the door of a helicopter working through rotor vibration, angular rate error, multiple wind environments, and the counterintuitive mechanics of the lagging lead, looking down at terrain the IRA believed it owned. Every escape route they had perfected, every firing position chosen for its distance from British ground observation, every open field selected precisely because no ground patrol would approach it. All of it visible from above. All of it potentially watched by someone who had done the methodical, patient, engineering-level work required to make an extraordinarily difficult shot repeatable, and then done it again. The IRA didn't lose South Armagh in a ground battle. They never lost it on the ground at all. They lost the sky above it. And the sky, as it turned out, was where the war was decided. Subscribe for more stories like this.